hiring. Why
Yeah.
why does this process start with hiring?
Yeah. As I mentioned, hiring is the single most important thing you do as a people leader, and arguably the most important thing any company does, because to execute on that strategy, you need people. And as a lot of first time managers or hiring managers, there isn't a training program for how to hire, right? No one, when you step into leadership, it's like, okay, now you're leading people, like go hire a team. And oftentimes you partner with your talent acquisition team, and there's generally been some guidance there, but they're ultimately relying on the hiring manager to direct, here's what I'm looking for, here's the attributes I'm testing for, but they haven't been properly trained. And so that really stuck out to me after, making some bad hires, is that, wow, this is not just I get to hire people as a manager. This is actually the most important thing I can do to set my team up and myself up and the company up for success. And when you have a culture and an organization that buys into that and believes that hiring is the most important thing, um, then that's where you really, like, the rubber meets the road, and you start to develop planning around hiring, and you start to develop standardization and process, and you start to see that um, the results reflected of that, with less attrition and less mishire and more faster ramp, right? So when you really focus on the hiring process and what happens in that interview, I think it really allows you to over index on building an exceptionally high performing team.
I totally agree. I'm curious. Curious if you can talk to me about your hiring process and what that process looks like, and maybe who's involved. I know in some companies they'll have larger organizations, or that are being larger organizations, they'll have the support of recruiting.
Oh,
Do you? I find it's way too easy, especially in a larger company, to just rely on your recruiting function or your HR function to find, source, and make the hire. I'm curious, how do you? Yeah, talk to me about your process and where kind of recruiting and HR's role is.
sure. I think they play a big role in the sense that they're there from a hiring manager's perspective to be a resource, but everything starts with having a plan. And I was introduced to this theory of a standardized interview guide by one of my mentors and friends, Sean Murray, current CRO of Greenhouse. Absolutely phenomenal people leader. When we were scaling out Sales Loft, we were hiring like crazy. And I mean, I think my peer and I spent probably 20 hours a week doing interviews and hiring. And Sean rolled out this standardized process of asking every candidate for the role the same series of questions. And at first, it felt really foreign and it felt really forced. Like, hey, I just kind of want to get to know these people. I know what I'm testing for. But what I realized is that, um, there was probably some bias, in my interview process, because I am who I am. And without, trying to interject the bias, it was just sort of naturally there. And by asking these standardized questions, it became a much more equitable process for all of the candidates, but it also gave me a different view of the candidate, because they were all answering the same question, and I got to hear how they answered it differently and how that influenced my opinion of that, and how it influenced whether or not I wanted to move forward with them. So it started with this sort of standardization of a plan, right? We're planning the interview. These are the questions we're going to ask. Um, and then, we
Do you mind if
iterated.
I double click on that? Because I think this is such an important piece that
Yeah.
I suspect there could be some people listening go, well, I don't have bias. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you were biased against hiring a particular demographic. Like, I'm going to come into an interview, I'm going to be biased towards people that have, maybe similar experience. I'm
Yeah.
going to be biased towards people that have worked at companies that I know. I'm going to have biases. They're not necessarily the DEI biases, or diversity, equity, inclusion. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
got
acronym right.
it.
DEI biases that might be top of mind. They're going to be biases that you're not really thinking of as like, oh, these are ones I have to watch out for.
Yeah.
I wanted to double click here because one of the advantages of a process like this, because I've gone through this, I've gone through freewheeling it and hired a bunch of guys that look like Colin, which was terrible. I mean, it wasn't bad. Those guys were great, but having a very homogeneous population as your first, 5 hires, not a good idea. The thing that I noticed when I was going through this, we did a very similar exercise, is that people are progressing that are surprising you. That you're like, wow, I wouldn't have my natural way of hiring, wouldn't have picked this up. I wouldn't have put this person through to the next round. Was it a similar experience for you?
Absolutely. And it's that unconscious bias that we are unconsciously interjecting into the process. Whereas when you're asking these, standardized questions, like you said, you're eliciting different responses that you might not have elicited by asking a question that you normally ask, or what you feel comfortable with, or what you think is the right question to ask. Um, you know, that's one of the main drivers that we care about at the company I work for now, which is uncovering those unconscious biases in the interview and surfacing that data to the hiring manager. Like, for instance, with Eng, this happens a lot where we actually did a study on this, when male interviewers interviewed female candidates, they asked them 25% less questions. So, and that was, not, again, that's unconscious bias. But if you think about that over time and extrapolate that, there were so many incredible female engineers that were not getting hired because they were asked fewer questions. And again, to bring it back to the DEI and just like the unconscious bias of a regular hiring manager, they don't mean to, right? But it's just their predisposition. And so, yeah, having that list of standardized questions really drives diverse points of view and moves them forward in the process faster, because you're like, wow, I would have I never asked that question before. And the answer I just got is really like illuminating.
Especially when it's your 6th interview of the day. And like,
Yeah.
I can freewheel an interview for like 1 or 2, but if you're spending half of your week, like literally 20 hours a week in interviews, being consistent with if you don't have a process, a set list of questions, is impossible. At least for me, I couldn't do it. Every interview did end up totally different.
Yeah. Yeah. Same for me. And I think also, as we think about like sort of the evolution of that process, where we took it from there was this standardized, list of questions, you'd short list from there. And then I'm a big believer of cross-functional buy-in. And so sort of that next step in the process is identifying key individuals that work cross-functionally that you want sort of their buy-in on this hire. And that may look like another peer, that may look like a peer manager or leader, a cross-functional partner they may work with. We try and keep the interview loop under 4 because there's sort of like diminishing returns. In between 4 and 8, we actually see a 50% increase in mishire the more interviews you have, which is really interesting. But it's just because there's the candidate withdrawal rate also increases as you think about, and you've probably had this experience, I have too. I have interviewed for roles that I've had 20 plus interviews. And by the end of the interview, I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been asked the same questions hundreds of times. That information is not being shared. And so it's just a bad candidate experience. So you miss out on great hires, which is why part of this evolution of my hiring process has been the standardization, 1 or 2 peer interviews or cross-functional interviews, alignment at the exec level, and then ultimately driving to the hire. And part of that cross-functional is a actual cultural aptitude, which it's like people that aren't going to be directly interacting with this individual, testing for sort of like, how do they live up to the company's values and the mission? And how do they articulate how they can sort of fit in which I find is equally as important as that standardized list of sort of aptitude behavioral questions. Because again, you could have someone that high aptitude, high performing, but if they're not a cultural fit, then that's just going to bring the team down. And again, result in just not great results ultimately.